Well, it's been a bit, but I want to talk about some Dungeons & Dragons drama too, so let's get into it. This story begins in the 90s with two companies, Wizards of the Coast, TSR, Tactical Studies Rules, created by Gary Gygax, one of the co-creators of Dungeons & Dragons, along with Dave Arneson. By the 90s, Lorraine Williams was the CEO of that company and had made an expansion of TSR and had made quite a bit of money with it. But they had also acquired a lot of debt and made some poor decisions and eventually were insolvent. So Lorraine approached Legends of the Five Rings Gaming to sell TSR to that company. That company couldn't afford it, so they approached Wizards of the Coast CEO Peter Atkison, who could. At the beginning of the 90s, Wizards of the Coast was a small gaming company, and one of the things they had done was made third-party materials for other gaming companies, for other role-playing games, adventures. And they had been sued, in fact, by Palladium for copyright violations that Palladium felt that Wizards had violated their copyright by making adventures without asking their permission or paying them a royalty. So Wizards of the Coast pivoted to other things, and eventually Peter Atkison hired Richard Garfield, and Richard Garfield made Magic the Gathering, and it became the first trading card game, and created a huge amount of cash for Wizards of the Coast. So by the end of the 90s, they were flush with cash, and they were able to purchase TSR. And because that, and being able to, being the printer or the producer of Pokemon, they had Magic the Gathering, Pokemon, and Dungeons & Dragons. Hasbro had an interest in them, and eventually Peter Atkison sold Wizards of the Coast to Hasbro. So at that point, Wizards of the Coast was creating a new edition of Dungeons & Dragons, the third edition, which is one of many people's favorite editions of Dungeons & Dragons. And this was the genesis of the open game license, which is where all this Dungeons & Dragons drama is coming from, because back then, the open game license was sort of an offshoot of the idea of freeware and open source software. And it was the brainchild of Ryan Dancey and Brian Lewis at Wizards of the Coast, and the purpose of it was to make it so that third parties could expand the game and create materials that Wizards of the Coast didn't necessarily want to create because they were low profit, or they used up resources when the resources could be used in other areas to make more profit, but also because it would foster innovation. So when they were developing third edition, they brought in this open game license, which is the first open game license for role-playing games. And until now, it had been very much celebrated, especially by Wizards of the Coast. So then we get into the next part of the story. The next part of the story is third edition Dungeons & Dragons and third-party publishers. There was basically a glut of product, but not just coming from Wizards of the Coast. It was coming from various players, dungeon masters, individuals, and also people that were creating game companies. Paizo was one of those companies, and in fact, it was created by several ex-employees of Wizards of the Coast. And they created their own role-playing game within the D20 system, which was a system created by Wizards of the Coast that was open source and anyone could use. So a lot of role-playing games during that time period used the D20 system that was centered around the 20-sided die. and Paizo was one of those, and they created a game called Pathfinder. And during that time, 3rd edition was doing very well, and Paizo and its Pathfinder were also doing very well. And then Wizards decided to pivot into 4th edition. So then we move in to 4th edition, and a very limited open game license by Wizards of the Coast. They basically shrunk the ability of people to create third-party stuff. They wanted an in-house game, and they wanted complete control over it. And that caused a lot of people to jump ship over to Paizo, which was making Pathfinder still, and Pathfinder was based on the beloved 3rd edition rules, and it was just very similar to that, and so players found it easy to jump over to Pathfinder and avoid 4th edition, which it wasn't necessarily that they didn't like the game, they just didn't like the direction Wizards was going by cutting out third-party support. And they also preferred their beloved 3rd edition, and Pathfinder was closer to that. So there was a sales slowdown for Dungeons & Dragons, and in fact Pathfinder seemed to be outselling Dungeons & Dragons. So this new upstart game, which was based on rule sets from a previous version of the first role-playing game, Dungeons & Dragons, was now outselling it, and that was something that obviously bothered the company that owned the first role-playing game. So they tried to stick with 4th edition, and they had this whole idea of a digital rollout of a bunch of promised ideas for bringing Dungeons & Dragons into the digital age and onto the internet. And those promises never really materialized because they quickly abandoned 4th edition and moved into the next phase. Before the next phase, however, there was this new thing happening online. There were podcasts being created and live plays of Dungeons & Dragons games, either in audio form or in video form. Acquisition Incorporated was broadcasting their games, and then Geek and Sundry was a new YouTube phenomenon in the geekosphere, and they were showing board game playing and also this new show called Critical Role, which employed a bunch of voice actors and very charming people to play Dungeons & Dragons and showcase the game on Geek and Sundry. Eventually, Critical Role would move into its own channel, but it started on Geek and Sundry. And then a whole lot of YouTubers came out of the woodwork and started creating their own content talking about Dungeons & Dragons. And it was during this period, when 4th edition was waning and Pathfinder seemed ascendant, that Wizards of the Coast abandoned their digital ideas and then moved into what they called D&D Next, which eventually became the next phase. So the next phase is 5th edition, and there was excitement around it, and all the stuff that came out from the playtesting, which was an extremely wide net of playtesting with people across the world, added to the excitement that was already there, in addition to all these YouTubers and live plays that was adding to this whole new community. The game started to grow again, and I think at this point Pathfinder may have, at least if you were going by, say, Google searches, like how much people were interested in which game, D&D started to once again eclipse all the other role-playing games. And it only went up from there. So there was a massive expansion, and there was a new OGL, and the SRD was released. But the new OGL basically resembled the old OGL, and people were happy because now these other third parties that had, many of them which had started with 3rd edition and had skipped 4th edition because they weren't invited to the party, and maybe had done other things in the interim, came back with a vengeance to 5th edition and supported the game as well as the community supported the game and the players and all the influencers, I guess. And this became a snowball rolling downhill until Critical Role became the most, I guess, valuable Twitch property. Basically, their streaming on Twitch generates the most revenue out of anybody streaming on Twitch. And this happened during the pandemic when people were stuck at home and looking for things to do. And Dungeons and Dragons was a great thing to do, along with other board games and other hobbies. But Dungeons and Dragons became massively ascendant during this time. And a lot of people were buying a lot of things. Magic the Gathering also became, I guess, huge, but a lot of product was being bought and product was being sold out. So Hasbro now had Dungeons and Dragons and Wizards of the Coast basically eclipsing their old products that they had, come up with years ago. The G.I. Joes, the Transformers, My Little Pony, those things that Hasbro was most known for. Now, the profit was coming from Dungeons and Dragons and Magic the Gathering, and those other properties seemed less than to Hasbro. And at the end of this, in I believe 2021, Wizards of the Coast bought D&D Beyond, and we moved into the next phase. The next phase is what most people would call the greed era, and this is when Magic the Gathering was expanding at a breakneck speed. Not expanding necessarily in the player base or customer base, but basically in how much money Wizards wanted to get out of Magic the Gathering, because they had already gotten quite a bit. And this had begun somewhere around, well, maybe 2010, when they started increasing the number of SKUs that they were putting out. So they put out a product, and then they put out different versions of that product. And then it got to the point where by the end of 2021, there were so many SKUs and so many different sets coming out that players just couldn't keep up. And the people spending money on Magic the Gathering were starting to get wallet fatigue. And Magic the Gathering's creator, or the company that was in control of it, Wizards, started to refer to their customers as being price sensitive. And it was the 30th anniversary, and they decided for these price sensitive customers that they should put out a incredibly expensive product that was not an actual product, really. So basically, a lot of people by now probably know that they put out a set of booster packs which had 15 cards in them, but they didn't have the same backing as Magic the Gathering cards. They were basically proxies that were not legal in tournaments, and therefore they were just pretty things to look at that you couldn't play at a local tournament or even a national tournament. And they were $1,000 for 4 booster packs, which was incredibly expensive. And then they went on sale, and then the sale was ended. Not that they sold out, the sale was ended because there was so much anger in the Magic community about this that it actually managed to convince people not to buy it. So people didn't. I believe the numbers are, and these are just rumors, that somewhere around 20,000 of these 4 booster pack boxes were made, and of those 20,000, 2,000 sold on the sale day, and 8,000 are going to be given for free to different game stores. So the number of free copies out there are going to be about 4 times the number of bought copies, and there's still copies that are not sold or given out. So there's even though it's only 20,000, it's a small number of product. They couldn't get rid of all of it, and it was a moment of Magic the Gathering players being very angry at Wizards, and also Wizards basically being embarrassed on the day of sale for this thing that angered their customer base. Sometime around then, the CEOs of Wizards of the Coast and Hasbro. Chris Cox is the CEO of Hasbro. Cynthia Williams, CEO of Wizards, discussed the idea that Dungeons and Dragons was under-monetized. And then we moved into, I guess, what you could call the final phase. So, like I said, Chris Cox is the CEO of Hasbro, and he came from Microsoft. And Cynthia Williams is the CEO of Wizards, and she also came from Microsoft, but also Amazon. So both of them have a video game and direct-to-consumer sales background, as do other executives that they've hired recently. And quite a few of them have microtransaction backgrounds, which indicates that's where Hasbro and Wizards is heading. Now, there are good microtransactions and bad microtransactions, or I guess if you ask someone else, maybe there's only bad microtransactions. But they seem to be focused on digital products, direct consumer sales, and microtransactions. And during this fireside chat that I mentioned, Dungeons & Dragons, in their opinion, was under-monetized, meaning that they need to get people to spend more money on Dungeons & Dragons. And the easiest way to do that is microtransactions. But Dungeons & Dragons, right now, pretty much only comes in books. And you can't charge microtransactions in books. So you need to get to Final Phase Part 2. So, the Final Phase Part 2 is the one D&D playtest, and the idea that they were going to create this virtual tabletop. It was going to be this great 3D digital environment where you could play Dungeons & Dragons as if you were playing with miniatures, but online. And, of course, there were other virtual tabletops at this point in time, which is obviously where the idea came from. But they're mostly 2D, and they're great, but they do have limits to them. And what Wizards was promising was something way beyond that. And, of course, as I mentioned, they had promised digital products before and not delivered. So this could have either, been less than what they said that they were going to make, or just it's never coming out. We don't actually know. But during this, someone leaked a new OGL. So it was more than just a leak, because it was kind of confirmed by Kickstarter, who said that they had spoken with Wizards, but they hadn't given any specifics about whether or not this OGL, leaked OGL, was real, but they insinuated it was. And Paizo also said that they had spoken with Wizards and also indicated that they thought this was real. And the problem with it was that its wording claimed that it could nullify the old OGL, which it seems unlikely based on the wording of the original OGL. But they obviously wanted to nullify the old OGL and replace it with this one, because this one gives them way, I guess, more favorable terms. I don't agree, and a lot of people don't agree that it gives them more favorable terms, but from the point of view of wanting a piece of the pie of everybody, I guess it does. So that was already egregious, and then you add in the fact that after someone earns $750K a year from making whatever for Dungeons and Dragons, whether it's an adventure, a supplemental material, YouTube videos, live plays, that they would start to owe 25% royalties to Wizards of the Coast. And the Kickstarter connection came in because if you kickstarted a project, you would only owe 20% of royalties, which I guess was Wizards being nice, because Kickstarter also charges fees. Not really sure. Maybe they were negotiating that with Kickstarter. But in any case, that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that, they could, with 30 days notice, which was the wording in this, they could change any part of the OGL that they wanted, meaning that they could change that $750K down to $10K. But even if they didn't, anyone that created anything that they thought was part of their new open game license that basically did anything with Dungeons and Dragons, they could use for whatever purpose, make money off of it in perpetuity and irrevocably, which is weird because they thought that they were able to revoke the original OGL. So they were essentially going to be able to take anyone's efforts and use it for their own. And they were being nice by not charging royalties to that person, but you're taking their thing from them. And that's what really rubbed the community the wrong way. So that's kind of how this, final phase seems to be panning out. And a bunch of companies have indicated that they are going to be involved in legal action. And they may be creating a whole new competing OGL. So here's Wizards' response. They posted it on the D&D Beyond website, and they had actually canceled their response twice before they put this out. The next OGL will contain the provisions that allow us to protect and cultivate the inclusive environment we are trying to build, and specify that it covers only content for TTRPGs. That means that other expressions, such as educational and charitable campaigns, live streams, cosplay, VTT uses, etc., will remain unaffected by any OGL update. Content already released under 1.0a, that's the original OGL, will also remain unaffected. What it will not contain is any royalty structure. It also will not include the license back provision that some people were afraid was a means for us to steal work. That thought never crossed our minds. Under any new OGL, you will own the content you create. We won't. Any language we put down will be crystal clear and unequivocal on that point. The license-back language was intended to protect us and our partners from creators who incorrectly allege that we steal their work simply because of coincidental similarities. So, what they're saying is, oops, we didn't know that you would take it that way. And we're going to do a take back. And we're going to be nice. So I guess we'll see if that pans out. So what's to come? There be a truly open game license, like the original, or even more open? Something more open source, maybe something that works with other companies, with their input, basically. Although the original OGL did have other companies' input and other lawyers from outside input. Or will the executives double down on their greed? Or, I guess, will it be a hybrid? Will this virtual tabletop ever come to be? Will it be as great as it was promised to be? And if it's closed system for Wizards only, I don't know, will Wizards fail again like it did before? And then we get to the idea of microtransactions. And good microtransactions. From my point of view anyway. Cosmetic microtransactions are good because I don't really care. If you don't want to look a certain way, you don't have to pay. If you want to look a certain way, then you got to pay for it. But you don't need to look a certain way. Although, I mean, you might argue that in Dungeons and Dragons you make a character and you want it to look a certain way, but that's true in every video game, and I've never really cared. I suppose some people do, so maybe to them cosmetic microtransactions are also egregious, but I just don't see it that way. And another type of microtransaction that I think actually would be good, and good for the community, is if this virtual tabletop has a modding aspect to it, in the way that basically anybody can create stuff, homebrewed stuff for Dungeons & Dragons and put it on Dungeon Masters Guild, or in the way that anyone can make a video game and put it on Steam and sell it. And Steam takes a cut, DM's Guild takes a cut. So therefore, Wizards would take a cut. But if it all worked and you have these tools to use the game engine and the graphics engine of this virtual tabletop to make your products, and you made really good stuff and people bought it from you, and Wizards took a 25%, 50%, I don't know. The point is that if it enabled you to make your own content that you could sell, then I would see that as being good, even if Wizards takes a cut, but other people might disagree. Now, of course, the bad microtransactions are the kind of microtransactions where they're pay to win, pay to play, which is basically you need this sword, you got to pay for it. You need this item, you got to pay for it. You need to, go this distance, you need to pay to be able to move further, or it has timed. The amount of time that you can spend in it is limited, and you can pay for more time. That kind of stuff. When they're trying to nickel and dime you just so to play the thing. When with video games, you originally could just buy a video game outright for $60, $80, whatever, and then you have that game, and you always have that game. But now they make the game, and it doesn't quite work at first, and they add stuff to it, and there's expansions, and then the game goes on forever, and you spend more and more, and then you got to pay to win, and that kind of stuff. So those are the bad microtransactions that could be coming. I don't know which it's going to be, or if it's ever going to come. But these are things that could happen, might happen, or won't happen. But Wizards, so far, has shown that they are going in the direction of the bad. They could pivot like they claim they are, and that they never intended to go that direction. But their actions have kind of shown who they are at this point. And I don't think that anyone should be under any illusions that things are going to be fine. They might not be. So what's next, I guess? Well, what's next is what you could do in response, I guess. And a lot of people already did these things, which is what caused Wizards to respond to it and claim that they never intended these things, which was people canceled their D&D Beyond subscriptions, which gave real-time data to Wizards about how angry people were, and also they tweeted a lot at them. There's been petitions that have signed, and I guess if you see more stuff from Wizards that you don't like, then let them know you don't like it. I mean, you don't actually need any of this, so it's not really that big of a deal, but if you want Dungeons & Dragons to go a certain way, you gotta let Wizards know which way you want it to go, what you're willing to spend money on, and what you're not. So, basically, communicate with Wizards, however you feel like communicating with Wizards, and let them know what it is you want and what you don't want. So, at the end of the day, Wizards doesn't own Dungeons & Dragons. You do. You already bought it 50 years ago, or you bought it 10 years ago. You bought it at some point in time. I'm not talking about these certain people who were talking about how they've only ever bought third-party products. I don't know why Wizards would care about you as a customer because you've never bought anything from them. But my point is that you've already bought Dungeons & Dragons, probably, if you're watching this, if you like to play Dungeons & Dragons. You bought it when you were younger. Usually people buy it when they're teenagers. Maybe you bought it as an adult. The point is, at some point, you bought one of the editions, either in the 70s, 80s, 90s, early 2000s, or recently. You own it. You can play it at a table with your friends. You never need anything else from Wizards. What Wizards needs to do is to entice you to take out your wallet and buy more books because you like the things they're putting out and you like the way they're running their company. Or you have other reasons to buy their products. The point is that you don't have to buy any of it. And Wizards needs to know this. They need to know that they have to be the curators of this great experience, this open game license, the curators of Dungeons & Dragons, and that they have to create a good product and entice you to purchase it. That doing things that antagonize the community only helps to shrink the community because people leave it and new people don't join. So hopefully we're at that point where they learn that lesson, but maybe they haven't. So basically what I'm saying is play the game at the table with your friends and don't really worry about what they're doing because they can't take it away from you. So what I'll just add to this video is something Ryan Dancey, like I said, one of the creators of the OGL, said in an interview recently on a live stream, and it was repeated by Peter Atkison on his live stream. Peter Atkison being the founder of Wizards of the Coast, the old CEO of Wizards of the Coast. The value of a network is determined by how many people are on the network. So you, as an individual, add to the value of the network more than the creator or owner does. This is why Facebook, Twitter, Steam, YouTube, and so on are free, because you are the product that those systems can sell and are much more valuable than making a product to sell to you. So Ryan and Peter are right that Wizards should view D&D as a system or network rather than a product, because once they do that, they unlock much more value, much more potential. Right now, they seem to be stuck in an archaic mercantile idea of zero-sum gain arguments over monetization. But that could all blow up in their face. I mean, already Paizo, Kobold, Frog God Games, MCDM, that's Matt Colville's company, and Lord of Troll Games have already pushed back on this idea. And in the case of Paizo and I believe Kobold, they are already planning to make a counter OGL, and that may be the catalyst that sends D&D into obscurity and Pathfinder into ascendancy again. So basically, just remember, you're more valuable than Wizards. You're more valuable than all the product that Wizards puts out. You're more valuable to them than they are to you. And that's how I want to end this. So, until next time, enjoy the game. Let other people know how much you enjoy the game. And let other people know how you feel. Let me know in the comments.